The day my son walked through that door with his chest puffed out, his designer shoes clicking on that cracked linoleum floor, and his lawyer standing behind him like a shadow, I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just smiled. And then I laughed. Not a polite little chuckle, not a nervous laugh. I mean, I laughed from somewhere deep in my chest, the kind of laugh that makes the nurses poke their heads in to check on you. And while I was laughing, I slowly lifted one finger and pointed at the television on the wall. His face. Oh, his face. It went from smug to confused, then confused to pale, then pale to something I can only describe as a man watching his entire world dissolve in real time. Because there, on the screen, on CNN, in big, bold letters, with a photo I hadn't even approved yet, was my name, and a number next to it that had more zeros than he could count. But before I tell you what happened in that room, you need to understand how I got there. You need to understand the whole story. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal. This is a story about what happens when you underestimate a woman who has spent 67 years learning exactly how to survive. My name is Margaret Callahan Rhodes, but everybody who's ever loved me, and even a few who didn't, calls me Peggy. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, the youngest of 5 children, to a steelworker father and a mother who could make a pot of soup last 3 days and somehow make it taste better every time. We didn't have much, but we had dignity, we had grit, and we had an unspoken rule in our house: you do not abandon your family, ever, for any reason. I carried that rule with me for 67 years. Through a marriage, a divorce, 2 businesses, 1 bankruptcy, 1 comeback, the death of my mother, the death of my best friend, a cancer scare that turned out to be nothing, and a cancer scare that turned out to be everything. I carried that rule, and apparently I forgot to pass it on to my son. Derek was born in 1982 on a Tuesday in October during a rainstorm so fierce the hospital lost power for 40 minutes. I should have seen that as a sign. I'm kidding, sort of. Derek was everything to me. When his father, Thomas, left when Derek was 9 years old, it was just the 2 of us against the world. I worked double shifts at the marketing firm where I was a junior account manager. I drove him to soccer practice in a car where the heat didn't work in winter. I bought his sneakers secondhand and polished them until they looked new. I helped him with every single science fair project, every college application essay, every moment that mattered. And he was a good boy. For a long time, he was a genuinely good boy. He went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship. I paid the rest. He graduated, got a job at a financial consulting firm in Columbus, met a woman named Brittany, and married her in a ceremony that cost more than my first house. I paid for half of that wedding, too, and I was happy to do it. That's what mothers do. That's what I believed. What I didn't see, what I chose not to see, because sometimes love makes you strategically blind, was the slow, creeping change that began in Derek somewhere around year 4 of his marriage to Brittany. Now, I want to be fair. Brittany didn't create Derek's greed. She didn't invent his selfishness. But she did water it. She fertilized it. She gave it sunlight and a nice pot to grow in. I'd hear things, little things, whispers through the phone, a comment she made at Thanksgiving about how I was sitting on money I'd never use, a question Derek asked me once, too casually, about whether I had a will, then a follow-up question about what was in it. I filed those things away. I'm the kind of woman who files things away. In March of 2022, I was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. I want you to sit with that word for a second. Not for sympathy, I don't need your sympathy, but because a diagnosis like that changes the air around you. It changes how people look at you. It changes how they talk to you. And sometimes it reveals exactly who they really are. I found out on a Wednesday. My neurologist, Dr. Patricia Osei, sat across from me in her office with that careful doctor face they all practice, and she explained what early stage meant, what the trajectory could look like, what my options were. I nodded. I asked questions. I took notes. Because that's who I am. Even in the worst moments, I take notes. I called Derek that evening. I told him the diagnosis. I explained that it was early stage, that I was going to be fine for quite some time, that I had a plan. There was a pause on the line, and then he said something that I have never forgotten. He said, "Mom, have you thought about long-term care options?" Not, "Mom, are you okay?" Not, "Mom, I love you." Not, "Mom, I'm coming over." Long-term care options. I let it go. I told myself he was being practical. I told myself that was just Derek's way. I told myself a lot of things that night that I now understand were simply not true. Here is where I need to stop and tell you something, because this part matters. This part is the whole engine of everything that follows. For the last 12 years, quietly and without fanfare, I had been building something. After my divorce from Thomas, after the bankruptcy in my late 30s that nearly swallowed me whole, I had clawed my way back into the marketing industry, not as an employee, as a founder. In 2010, I started a small consulting firm out of my home office in Dayton, Ohio. I called it ClearPath Strategic Communications. We worked with mid-sized companies on brand repositioning, crisis communications, and executive messaging. It was not glamorous. In the beginning, it was just me, a laptop, and a $200 standing desk from Walmart. But I was good at what I did, better than good. By 2015, I had 6 employees. By 2018, I had 22. By 2021, I had brought in a silent business partner, a man named James Harlow, an old friend from my early career days in Cincinnati, who had made a quiet fortune in tech. And together, we had restructured ClearPath into something much bigger. We were in acquisition talks with a mid-sized media conglomerate out of Atlanta. Now here is the critical detail. I kept this quiet, not from malice, not from secrecy, but because I'd learned something in 60-plus years of living. Money changes people. The possibility of money changes people even faster. Derek knew I had a consulting business. He thought it was something I did to keep busy. He thought it was a hobby with invoices. He did not know what it had become, and I had never corrected that impression. James knew. My attorney, Robert Whitefield, knew, my accountant knew, and my best friend, Dorothy, who I'd known since 1987, who I played cards with every Sunday, she knew. But Derek thought his mother had a modest retirement account, a paid-off house worth maybe $340,000, and about $80,000 in savings. He was focused on that $80,000 like a dog staring at a bone through a glass door. 6 weeks after my diagnosis, Derek drove up from Columbus on a Saturday morning. No call ahead, just showed up. I made coffee, we sat at my kitchen table, and then he pulled out a folder. A folder! My son pulled out a printed folder at my kitchen table like he was about to present a business proposal. Inside was information about nursing homes, but not just any nursing homes. He hadn't done research on the best facilities in Ohio. He hadn't looked into highly rated memory care centers or top-tier assisted living communities. He had found the cheapest option within 50 miles of his house that was still technically licensed. Sycamore Creek Care Center in Lancaster, Ohio. The reviews were not encouraging. He explained to me calmly, clinically, with that rehearsed tone that told me Brittany had coached him on exactly what to say, that given my diagnosis, given my age, given the uncertainty of the future, it made sense for me to transition into a managed care environment. He said transition, like I was a business asset being restructured. I looked at the folder. I looked at my son. I looked at the coffee mug in my hand, a mug that said World's Greatest Mom that Derek had given me for Christmas in 2003. And I made a decision in that moment. I said, "Okay, Derek, if that's what you think is best." He blinked. He had prepared for a fight. He had not prepared for agreement. "Really?" he said. "Really," I said. "Give me 3 weeks to put my affairs in order." What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that those 3 weeks were going to be the most important 3 weeks of my professional life. I called James Harlow the same afternoon Derek drove back to Columbus. James answered on the second ring. He always answered on the second ring. I said, "James, I need to accelerate the timeline." There was a pause. Then he said, "How fast?" I said, "As fast as we can legally do this. And James, I need my name off the operational paperwork, completely off. I need it to look like I stepped away from the company entirely." Another pause. Longer this time. Then James Harlow, a man I have seen negotiate contracts worth millions of dollars without breaking a sweat, said very quietly, "That boy has no idea who he is dealing with." "No," I said, "he doesn't, and I'd like to keep it that way for a little while longer." Over those 3 weeks, Robert Whitfield restructured my ownership stake in ClearPath into a holding entity that James controlled on paper. My name did not appear anywhere visible. My assets, and by this point we were talking about something considerably beyond that $80,000 Derek was eyeing, were moved and restructured in a way that was entirely legal, entirely documented, and entirely invisible to anyone who wasn't looking in exactly the right places. I also updated my will, significantly. I signed papers, I had long phone calls, I worked from my kitchen table 12 hours a day, and at the end of 3 weeks, I packed 2 suitcases, said goodbye to my house, and let my son drive me to Sycamore Creek Care Center in Lancaster, Ohio. He carried my bags inside, he smiled at the staff, he shook hands with the director, a tired-looking man named Gary, who showed us around a facility that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. My room was small, the window looked out at a parking lot, the mattress had a slight dip in the middle that I would eventually learn to roll away from. Derek hugged me in the hallway. It lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked out to his car and drove away. I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. The first week at Sycamore Creek was genuinely one of the hardest of my life. Not because of the facility, though the facility was exactly as grim as the review suggested, but because no matter how prepared you think you are, no matter how much logic you've wrapped around the situation, there is something that happens to your heart when your child leaves you somewhere and stops calling. Derek called twice in the first month. Both calls were short. Both calls ended with him asking vague questions about whether I had gotten around to writing down any account information just in case. After the second call, I put my phone down, looked out at that parking lot, and I let myself feel it, the full weight of it, the grief and the fury and the loneliness. I gave myself 45 minutes, and then I got up, washed my face, and went back to work. Because here's what Derek had not calculated. Sycamore Creek had Wi-Fi. Old Wi-Fi, slow Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi that cut out every time it rained, but Wi-Fi. And I had my laptop, my phone, and Robert Whitfield's direct number saved in my contacts. The acquisition talks with the Atlanta Media Group, Meridian Media Holdings, had entered their final stage. James and I were in communication daily, sometimes hourly. I was reviewing term sheets from my adjustable height hospital bed. I was on calls with Meridian's legal team while the woman in the room next to mine watched The Price is Right at full volume. I made friends, too. I want you to know that. I don't want you to picture me as some solitary figure hunched over a laptop in a dim room. There was Dorothy Keene, not my Dorothy from home, but a different Dorothy, a 79-year-old retired school teacher from Chillicothe who had the sharpest mind and the wickedest card game I have ever encountered. There was a man named Earl Patterson who had spent 40 years as a jazz musician and could still play the harmonica well enough to make the night nurses stop and listen in the hallway. There was Nurse Linda, who worked the morning shift, who called me Miss Peggy and always made sure I got the window table at breakfast. There was Carlos, an aide in his 20s, who brought me an extra blanket without being asked, and once drove 20 minutes on his lunch break to get me a specific brand of herbal tea that the facility didn't stock. These people became my world, and they made the small room and the parking lot view and the dipping mattress entirely bearable. But I never stopped working. In month 4, Meridian Media Holdings made a formal offer. I will not bore you with every detail of acquisition negotiations, though I could, because I find them genuinely fascinating in the way that chess is fascinating, layers of strategy inside layers of strategy. What I will tell you is that the final number on that term sheet was not what I had expected. It was significantly higher. James called me when the final offer came in. I was sitting in the Sycamore Creek common room playing gin rummy with Dorothy Keene and a quiet man named Harold who always smelled like peppermint candies. My phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. I saw James' name. "Dorothy," I said, "hold my cards." I stepped into the hallway. James said the number. I stood very still for a moment. Then I said, "Say it again." He said it again. I leaned against the wall. I looked up at the flickering fluorescent light above me. I took one breath, then two. Then I said, "Tell them yes." By month 5, Derek had stopped calling entirely. Not a text, not a voicemail, not a card. I know this because I kept a small notebook, a habit I've had since I was a girl, and every day I would write down whatever happened that was worth noting. For 5 months, there was not a single entry about contact from my son. Dorothy Keene asked me once, gently, over breakfast, whether I had family coming to visit for the holidays. I said, "I have something better than a visit coming. I just have to be a little patient." She looked at me over her coffee cup with the expression of a woman who has seen enough of life to know when someone is sitting on a secret. She said, "Peggy Callahan Rhodes, you are the most interesting person in this building." I said, "Dorothy, I'm the most interesting person in most buildings." She laughed until she spilled her orange juice. The acquisition closed on a Thursday in February. The deal became public knowledge 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, when Meridian Media Holdings issued a press release announcing the acquisition of ClearPath Strategic Communications and the appointment of its founder, me, to the position of Chief Executive Officer of Meridian's newly formed Communications Division. The press release included a quote from me, it included the deal valuation, it included a photograph. James had warned me it was coming. I had had some input on the timing and the wording, but I had not anticipated, nobody had, that by Sunday afternoon the story would be picked up by CNN, by the Wall Street Journal, by Forbes. Forbes ran a short piece that included a sidebar on my net worth. That number, that one that appeared on television and in print and on every financial news crawler that Sunday, was not the kind of number that a woman living in room 114 of Sycamore Creek Care Center was supposed to have. But there it was. I found out the story had gone national when Carlos poked his head into my room that Sunday afternoon. He was holding his phone with an expression I'd never seen him before. Eyes wide, mouth slightly open. He said, "Miss Peggy." I looked up from my book. He turned his phone around. I looked at the screen. I saw my photograph. I saw my name. I saw the number. I set my book down very slowly. "Carlos," I said, "would you mind turning on the television?" He fumbled with the remote. He found CNN, and there, in the lower third ticker, scrolling across the screen, was my name. Carlos sat down in the visitor's chair without being invited. I don't think he even realized he'd done it. We watched together in silence for about 30 seconds. Then he said very quietly, "You're a billionaire." I said, "I'm working on it." He burst out laughing. Then he stopped. Then he said, "Miss Peggy, does your son know?" I looked at the television. I smiled. "Not yet," I said, "but he's going to find out very soon." Derek showed up on a Tuesday. Not a call ahead, no warning, just a knock on my door, and there he was, dressed in a navy blazer, Brittany waiting in the parking lot in their Audi, and a man I didn't recognize standing just behind him. The man had a briefcase. He was wearing a gray suit. He had the particular expression of a lawyer who has been asked to do something that is technically legal, but slightly uncomfortable. Derek smiled at me, that particular smile of his, the one he had learned somewhere in his 30s that was designed to communicate confidence and instead communicates something else entirely. He said, "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling?" First time he'd spoken to me in 2 months, first visit in nearly 4. "Hi, Mom." "I'm feeling wonderful, Derek," I said. "Come in, sit down." He came in, he looked around the room, his jaw tightened slightly at the small space, the parking lot view, the dipping mattress, though he said nothing about any of it. He sat in the chair, his lawyer remained standing near the door. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. What followed was a performance. I give him credit, he had rehearsed it. He spoke about estate planning and future care costs and being proactive about financial organization. He used the word proactive 4 times in 5 minutes, which is a word people use when they want to sound responsible while doing something irresponsible. He told me he was worried about my hidden savings. That was the phrase he used, hidden savings. He slid a piece of paper across to me. It was a legal document, something about power of attorney, something his lawyer had drafted, something that would have given Derek significant control over my finances. I looked at the document. I looked at my son. He said, "Mom, I just want to make sure everything is protected, for you, for your care." He said it with such sincerity that for a moment the old love in me, the love that had bought secondhand sneakers and polished them until they shone, wanted to believe him. But I had a notebook with 5 months of silence in it and a television on the wall. I said, "Derek." He looked up. I said, "Before we go any further, I want you to look at something." I picked up my remote control. I turned on the TV. CNN was already on the financial segment. They were doing an update on the Meridian acquisition. The anchor was explaining the deal, the valuation, the strategic implications, and then my photograph came on the screen. My name appeared below it in white letters. The ticker at the bottom showed the number. Derek went very still. His lawyer shifted behind him. On the screen, the anchor said, "Margaret Callahan Rhodes, founder of ClearPath Strategic Communications, is expected to serve as the new CEO of Meridian's communications division. Sources close to the deal confirm the acquisition values Callahan Rhodes' stake at," and there was the number, the full number, the one with the zeros. I watched my son's face. I have thought about this moment many times in the months since it happened. I have thought about what I felt watching it, and what I felt was complicated. It was not pure triumph, it was not clean satisfaction, it was something more layered than that, something that had grief woven into it alongside the justice, because that is the thing about being betrayed by your own child. Even when you win, there is a piece of you that wishes you had never needed to. But I watched his face go pale. I watched the confusion move through it first, the trying to make sense of what he was seeing, the scrambling of his mental picture of his mother, the woman in room 114 with the dipping mattress. Then came the calculations. I could see them happening, his eyes moving slightly, the way they do when he is doing math. And then the full understanding arrived. His face turned the color of old concrete. The lawyer behind him had also gone very quiet. I waited. Derek looked from the television to me, then back to the television, then back to me. He said, "Mom, what is—" I said, "That's me, Derek." He said, "But how?" I said, "ClearPath, the consulting company, the hobby with invoices you believe you called it once." He had nothing to say to that. I want to tell you what I said next because I had been composing it in my head in a small way for months. I said, "Derek, I have loved you since before you took your first breath. I worked double shifts in a car with no heat to get you through childhood. I paid for half your wedding. I never once asked you for anything in return, because that is not why you love your children. But I am going to say this to you now clearly and once. You put me in this room, in this facility, with that parking lot view because you wanted my money and you wanted me out of the way. You stopped calling because you felt guilty, and you are here today not because you love me, but because you saw a number in a newspaper and it scared you. That document your lawyer brought can go back in his briefcase. You have no claim on my estate. I restructured everything months ago with Robert Whitfield before I ever set foot in this building. There is nothing here for you to take. But here is what I want you to understand. I didn't do this to punish you. I did this because I needed to know who you really were. And now I know. And now you know that I know. And we can both decide what we want to do with that information." The room was completely silent. The television murmured in the background. Derek opened his mouth, closed it. The lawyer cleared his throat. Derek said, "Mom?" I said, "Not today, Derek. I think you need to go home." He stood up slowly. He looked at me for a long moment, a look I hadn't seen on his face since he was a boy, actually, a look that was younger than the blazer and the briefcase and the rehearsed words, something underneath all of that. He said, "I'm sorry." Just that, just those 2 words. And I said, "I know, I believe you, but sorry is a beginning, not an ending, and we have a long way to go before we get to an ending." He nodded. He walked out. His lawyer followed. Through the window, I watched the Audi pull out of the parking lot. The aftermath. I stayed at Sycamore Creek for 3 more weeks after that. Not because I had to. I had the resources to move immediately into any facility in the country, or to go home, or to go anywhere. I stayed because of Dorothy Keene and Earl Patterson with his harmonica, and Nurse Linda with her "Good morning, Miss Peggy," and Carlos, who had sat in that chair with wide eyes and watched history happen with me. I wanted to say proper goodbyes. I wanted to leave correctly. On my last morning, Carlos brought me my specific brand of yerba tea without being asked. Dorothy Keene gave me a card she'd made herself out of construction paper and markers. I still have it on my desk. Earl played one song on his harmonica in the hallway, and 3 nurses stopped to listen. I gave the facility a donation before I left, a significant one, specifically earmarked for improved staff wages, updated room furnishings, and better Wi-Fi. Gary, the tired-looking director, shook my hand with both of his. I said, "Take care of these people, Gary." He said, "Yes, ma'am, we will." I moved into a condo in Columbus in March, 12 floors up, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the Scioto River that I never get tired of looking at. I started my role at Meridian in April. I am 67 years old, and I have never worked harder or with more clarity in my life. James Harlow sent me flowers on my first day. The card said, "I told you he had no idea." I put those flowers on my desk and looked at them for a long time. Derek and I began what I can only call cautious, careful reconstruction, not reconciliation. That word implies a return to what was before, and what was before is gone. But reconstruction, building something new on a foundation that now has no illusions in it. He called me 6 weeks after the visit to Sycamore Creek, not to ask for money, not with a folder, just to call. We talked for 40 minutes. He cried at some point. I let him. I did not cry, but I wanted to. We are not where we need to be. I don't know if we ever fully will be, but we are moving, slowly, difficult, uncertain, towards something. And I have learned in 67 years that movement, even slow, difficult, uncertain movement, is everything.